12 feet 3 inches. That is the recorded interior clearance of the door frames in the private residence built for Anna Swan in Tartaria, Nova Scotia in the 1870s. Not the ceremonial entrance, not the barn, the interior door frames, the ones she would have passed through every morning to reach her kitchen. I accepted the official record for years the way most people do, without looking at it too carefully. Anna Swan, born 1846, died 1888, 7 feet 11.5 inches tall, a performer under the Barnum banner, later married to Captain Martin Van Buren Bates, himself listed at 7 feet 9 inches, pituitary gigantism, rare, tragic, exploited. The story writes itself cleanly, and for a long time I let it. Then I started looking at the architecture more carefully, not the promotional photographs, not the cabinet cards, the buildings, the private ones, not the exhibition halls, and once I started, I found I genuinely could not stop. A woman recorded at under 8 feet does not require 12-foot clearance to live in her own home. The arithmetic doesn't resolve. You can attribute an extra foot, perhaps 18 inches, to builders' convention, to future-proofing, to the eccentricities of rural Nova Scotia craftsmanship, but not 3.5 feet, not systematically. Not when the same proportional excess begins to appear, quietly and consistently, in the residential and civic structures associated with other performers of the same era and the same circuit. Not when you start measuring the spaces these individuals actually inhabited rather than the numbers printed on their exhibition posters. What I want to suggest to you, carefully, because I think precision matters here more than almost anywhere else, is that there may be a distinction we have never been asked to examine between the height that was recorded and the height that was real, between the number that fit the narrative of the era and the number that fit the doorframe. Those are not necessarily the same number. Hold that distinction, we're going to need it. Because the further back you trace the infrastructure of the 19th century, the more you encounter spaces that were not built for the people who were said to inhabit them. And when you start asking who they were actually built for, the circus begins to look considerably less like entertainment. Angus MacAskill was born in 1825 on the Isle of Berneray in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. He immigrated to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, as a child. He is recorded at 7 feet 9 inches tall, and at the time of his death in 1863, he weighed, depending on the source, somewhere between 580 and 600 pounds. The official medical framing is consistent and familiar. Pituitary gigantism, a hormonal disorder of the anterior pituitary gland resulting in abnormal skeletal growth, typically accompanied by joint degradation, cardiovascular strain, reduced muscle efficiency, and a shortened, often painful life. That is the diagnosis. That is what the record suggests. Now hold the diagnosis in one hand and hold this in the other. Contemporary accounts, not promotional literature, but sworn testimonies and local records from Cape Breton residents who knew him, describe MacAskill lifting a ship's anchor weighing in excess of 2,700 pounds from the harbour floor and raising it to chest height. I want to be precise about what that number means physiologically. The world record for a deadlift under modern powerlifting conditions, performed by an athlete in peak health with optimized biomechanics, sits below 1,200 pounds. MacAskill, if the accounts are accurate, performed approximately double that, reportedly more than once, without training context, without a competitive structure, and while supposedly suffering from a degenerative endocrine disorder. Pathological gigantism does not produce this. It produces the opposite. The disease degrades connective tissue. It weakens joints. It creates bones that are long but structurally compromised. I'm not saying the accounts are beyond question. I am saying that the strength profile described in those accounts does not belong to a sick man. It belongs to something the medical literature of the 19th century had no category for. And MacAskill was not alone. The pattern, once you begin tracing it, is the thing that stops you. The same paradox appears in the documented records of Martin Van Buren Bates, of Fyodor Makhanov in Russia, of various unnamed performers traveling under different exhibition banners across the same decades. Extraordinary structural strength. unusual proportional symmetry. A conspicuous absence of the skeletal deformities, the enlarged hands, the pronounced brow ridges, the arthritis, that characterize genuine pituitary gigantism in clinical settings. The disease they were given as an explanation does not fit the bodies that the evidence describes. What it may fit, and I want to be careful here, because this is where the investigation asks more than it answers, is a different baseline, not a pathology deviating upward from our norm, but a norm deviating downward from theirs. Remember that possibility, because the architecture is about to start making a different kind of sense. Here is what the standard historical account asks us to accept. In the mid-19th century, across multiple continents, within roughly the same three-decade window, an unusual concentration of individuals with the same rare endocrine disorder happened to surface in the same cultural context, the traveling exhibition, at the same historical moment. All of them displaced, most of them without clear records of origin. Many of them described, in the language of the era, as having been found or discovered rather than born into documented communities. The official framing treats this as a coincidence of showmanship. Barnum and his counterparts simply had good scouts. I want to sit with that explanation for a moment, because there is a competing framework, one that mainstream historiography does not engage with seriously, but which I think deserves a precise and honest examination, that proposes something different. It proposes that the mid-1800s were not a period of industrial ascent so much as a period of recovery. That what we interpret as the beginning of the modern world may have been, in material terms, the aftermath of something older ending. That the cities being built across North America and Europe during this period show, in their foundations, their buried ground floors, their sediment-filled lower stories, evidence not of new construction but of excavation, of reclamation, of people inheriting structures they did not build and filling them to a scale they did not require. The phenomenon sometimes called the mud flood, and I use that term descriptively, not as an endorsement of any specific theory, refers to a proposed large-scale depositional event or series of events that may account for the peculiar stratigraphy of 19th-century urban centers worldwide, streets raised, ground floors buried, entire architectural registers swallowed below the new grade of civilization. If that framework has any validity, and I am not claiming it does, only that the physical anomalies it attempts to explain are real and documented, then the giants begin to look less like medical curiosities and more like survivors. Individuals of a prior scale, wandering a world that had been literally resurfaced around them, encountered by a new civilization that had no framework for what they were and chose the most convenient one available. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't encountered elsewhere, consider joining this research by subscribing. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Now back to the question of framing, because the choice of framework, what story gets told about these individuals and why, is not incidental to this investigation. It may be the investigation, because someone at some point had to decide what to call them, and the name they chose, the container they built around these bodies and these lives, was not a hospital. It was not a university. It was not a government record. It was a circus, and that choice was not, I want to suggest, an accident. In October of 1869, workers digging a well on a farm in Cardiff, New York, unearthed what appeared to be the petrified body of a giant man, roughly 10 feet in length. Within days, crowds were paying 50 cents, a significant sum, to stand in a field and look at it. Within weeks, it was a national sensation. P.T. Barnum offered $60,000 to lease it. When the owner refused, Barnum commissioned his own copy and exhibited it anyway, publicly declaring the original a fake. The original was, in fact, already a fake, a carved gypsum statue buried the previous year by a tobacconist named George Hull, who had conceived the entire scheme as a pointed satire of biblical literalism and the public's appetite for giants. The Cardiff giant was a hoax. That part is not in dispute. What I want you to hold carefully is what happened in the years immediately following. The Cardiff giant did not diminish public fascination with giant remains. It redirected it. It installed, at the center of the cultural conversation about anomalously large human beings, a reflex, a preloaded interpretive response. You see a giant, your first instinct becomes, it's probably plaster, it's probably a trick, someone is probably trying to sell you something. Let me say that plainly, a confirmed and celebrated hoax, occurring at precisely the moment when genuine large individuals were being routed into the exhibition circuit, had the precise psychological effect of making those genuine individuals harder to take seriously, not impossible to see, harder to scrutinize. The Cardiff giant did not hide the giants. It inoculated the public against believing in them. I'm not suggesting Hull was a knowing participant in something larger. I genuinely don't know that, and I won't claim it. But I am asking you to consider the function that events served, regardless of intent, because the timing is not comfortable. The 1869 hoax lands at the midpoint of the busiest decades of giant exhibition in recorded history. It lands precisely when the question of what these individuals actually were was most alive and most dangerous. The circus was already the designated space of acceptable unreality. The Cardiff giant made giants its permanent residence. And once the public had laughed at the plaster man in the Cardiff field, they were far less likely to ask serious questions about the living ones standing in the sawdust ring. That may have been the most efficient suppression mechanism of the entire era. Not a conspiracy, a cultural reflex. Engineered or accidental, it worked the same way either way. Remember that mechanism, because what's coming next suggests the inoculation may have extended beyond psychology into the buildings themselves. Begin with a door, not Anna Swan's door this time, a different one. The main entrance to the original Cincinnati Post Office and Custom House, completed in 1885, features a primary portal clearance of just over 18 feet. The building was designed to process mail and collect tariffs. Its daily occupants were postal clerks, customs agents, and members of the general public. The average American male in 1885 stood approximately 5 feet, 7 inches tall. The door that admitted him to conduct his civic business was more than 3 times his height. The standard explanation for this is aesthetic. Grand civic architecture of the 19th century favored imposing scale as an expression of institutional authority. Tall columns, high vaults, oversized thresholds, these were the visual vocabulary of power, borrowed from classical antiquity and deployed to signal permanence, legitimacy, the weight of the state. That explanation is reasonable. I want to be fair to it. But it does not fully account for what you find when you begin measuring not just the ceremonial entrances, but the functional interior spaces, the service corridors, the sorting rooms, the staff passages that no visiting dignitary would ever see and that no aesthetic program would ever require to impress. In the Cincinnati building and in comparable structures of the same era, the old GPO in London, the Chicago Federal Building of 1880, the main hall of the St. Petersburg Post Office, these utilitarian interior clearances run consistently between 14 and 20 feet. Rooms designed for work, not spectacle, built to a scale that has no obvious aesthetic justification and no ergonomic necessity for the people documented as using them. Let me say that again more carefully. The back rooms are as large as the front rooms. The spaces no one was meant to admire are proportioned the same as the spaces everyone was meant to be awed by. If the scale were purely theatrical, you would expect it to concentrate at the facade, at the public threshold, at the points of impression. You would not expect it to continue uniformly into the spaces where the mail was sorted. 3 continents, no shared architectural firm, all building to the same interior scale that exceeds any documented functional or aesthetic requirement for the humans they employed. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider supporting the work. This series goes to places the mainstream narrative declines to acknowledge, and that research takes time to do carefully. Now back to the buildings, because we haven't yet arrived at the most uncomfortable question they raise, which is not why these spaces were so large. It's what happened to our understanding of them once the people who may have fit inside them were gone. Because the bodies of those individuals, the physical evidence that might have allowed us to resolve this, did not pass quietly into the historical record. They were taken, and the taking was not incidental. Charles Byron died in London in June of 1783. He was Irish, recorded at 7 feet 7 inches, and he had spent the last years of his life as an exhibition figure, displayed, observed, measured, discussed. He knew before he died what institutions wanted from his body. He knew it with enough certainty that he made explicit legal arrangements to prevent it. His stated wish, documented and witnessed, was to be buried at sea, beyond the reach of the surgeons and the collectors who had already, while he still lived, begun negotiating for his skeleton. He was 22 years old when he made those arrangements. He was 22 years old when he died. His body never reached the sea. John Hunter, the most prominent anatomist in Britain, acquired it within days of Byron's death. The precise mechanism of that acquisition, whether through bribery of the undertaker, interception of the coffin, or some other means, is not definitively established by the historical record. What is established is that Byron's skeleton has been on display at the Hunterian Museum in London, in various configurations, for the better part of 2.5 centuries, despite the documented legal wishes of the man it belonged to, and despite formal legal challenges mounted by researchers and Byron's living Irish descendants as recently as 2023. Let me say that again slowly. A man explicitly arranged, in writing, for his remains not to be taken. They were taken anyway. They have been held continuously by an institution for 240 years, and every legal effort to return them to the earth or to his community of origin has been, so far, unsuccessful. Byron is not an isolated case. The pattern repeats with a consistency that I find, the more I document it, it is genuinely difficult to attribute to coincidence. The remains of Angus Mac Askill were claimed by collectors within years of his death. The skeletal material associated with multiple American exhibition giants passed into university and private collections through channels that their families either contested or were never informed of. In case after case, across Britain, America, and the European continent, the bodies of these individuals moved, upon death, out of the reach of public examination and into the custody of institutions that have not, in most cases, permitted independent skeletal analysis. Not one, not two. Across 3 continents, in nations with no coordinated institutional relationship, the same category of remains disappeared into the same category of private collection. The official explanation, where one is offered at all, is scientific interest. Unusual anatomy merits study, that is fair, but study implies documentation, and documentation implies a record that can be examined. What the pattern suggests instead is custody without transparency, possession without publication. The bodies were taken, and then, in terms of what the public was permitted to learn from them, they were simply gone. What was in those bones that required such careful, sustained, multi-generational keeping? That question does not resolve here, but it does reframe what comes next, because the disappearance of the bodies was not the last thing that happened to the world these individuals may have inhabited. The world itself was about to be standardized, and the standardization was thorough. Here is what this investigation has found, stated as plainly as I can manage. The recorded heights of 19th century exhibition giants do not match the architectural clearances of the spaces they privately inhabited. The physical capabilities attributed to those individuals do not match the medical diagnosis used to explain them. The civic infrastructure of the era was built to an interior scale that exceeds any documented aesthetic or functional requirement for the people recorded as using it. The bodies of these individuals were systematically acquired by institutions upon death, against the expressed wishes of the individuals themselves, and have not been made available for independent analysis. And the primary cultural mechanism for thinking about giants, the hoax reflex, the circus frame, the Barnum lens, was installed at precisely the moment when these individuals were most visible and most in need of serious examination. Those are not interpretations. Those are the documented facts of the record. What they mean, I cannot tell you with certainty. I want to be honest about that. I have spent a long time in these archives, and I do not have a clean conclusion to offer. What I have is a shape, a silhouette of something that the official record does not explain and has not tried to. The door frames are too tall, the bones were taken, the hoax arrived on time, the back rooms are as large as the front rooms, the bodies were strong when the disease said they should be weak, the records of their families stop, the buildings remain, but we stopped asking who built them. Once you hold all of that at once, something shifts, and it does not shift back. If this series is raising questions worth sitting with, leave your thoughts below. The responses to these investigations have suggested lines of inquiry I hadn't considered, and that research belongs to everyone doing it. The next investigation goes somewhere I wasn't ready to go until recently. It begins with a single cartographic anomaly, a coastline that appears on maps made before the relevant coastline was, according to the official record, accessible to any known expedition. I wasn't sure I was prepared to follow that thread. I think I am now. We didn't just lose the giants. We lost the world that was built for them.